I'm AJ. I'm from Cisco. I'm a product manager working on SD WAN, specifically focusing on managed service providers, helping them understand, deploy, and enable new business with SD WAN technology. To kick the session off this morning, we have three presenters. We'll cover a couple of different areas around what MEF is doing with SD WAN. We thought we'd break it up a bit since we had David, and David this morning so far. So we've done some, here we have some market research that was done by Heavy Reading that MEF has access to and is able to present. So we see here that across 125 service provider professionals that there's quite a lot of interest in SD-WAN. I mean, that doesn't really come too much as a surprise. But we can see that 47% of SPs out there already have implemented a commercial SD-WAN solution. And another 47%, if we aggregate the next three blue bars, are basically building or about to build a commercial SD-WAN solution within the next 2 years. And just a tiny minority there are still considering what they're going to do. So obviously a lot of interest. And here we see what the biggest threats are as considered by the service providers. I think 1 and 2 are very interesting. The complexity of managing a multi-vendor ecosystem. And certainly that's something here with the standardization activities that we think we'll be able to help with by defining a common language, a common set of service definitions. Hopefully managing those vendors becomes easier for the service providers. And we see managing a multi-cloud SD-WAN deployment as well. And that's an area that we're tackling as part of the next version of the MEF-SDCP documentation. And then we see a couple of other areas. I think down the bottom there, limited enterprise demand for managed SD-WAN services. Well, it's at the bottom of a reason. I think there's very significant demand. And we've seen, of course, that approximately 50 to 60% of enterprises out there are expecting that they will consume SD-WAN as a managed service. And of course, this then blends into the SD-WAN standardization activities. So we can see that basically standards are really important across the board with only very minor numbers on the sides of those bars indicating that they're not important or they're unsure. And we see that the activities in MEF here, the application security and normalizing the language and terminology for SD-WAN are two areas that we're tackling directly. And these then carry over into other benefits such as automating multiple SD-WAN implementations. So that standardization activity benefits everyone across the board in these areas. And that leads us into where SD-WAN and the standard definition fits into the strategy. Obviously, this is a major market driver. So the intention of the standard documents is to be able to accelerate market growth, bring confidence to the market, and of course, enable a common understanding of services. And then the next step of that is to start to blend the overlay SD-WAN services with other MEF standardized underlay services, which gives us a very powerful hybrid networking environment that is in turn orchestrated by the LSO API set. And so that's here is an example of what that might look like. So we have the overlay services, the cloud connectivity at the top of the slide there. And then we have the underlay services, carrier Ethernet, IP, and optical services, the LSO orchestration framework, and of course the certification of all of the above. So this brings quite a lot of value to everybody because we can standardize and certify the transport networks. We can standardize and certify the overlay networks. Everyone understands what they're getting and what it means. And of course, we can orchestrate it, which brings the automation benefits end to end across the service provisioning and management. So the expected market impact of all of this is that we'll be able to simplify the buying and selling process. That's going to in turn into more business for everybody, we hope. It combines policy of the overlay services with the underlay services. So that's going to improve our application experience for end users. And it facilitates service orchestration with the LSO architecture, So that moves us towards the self-driving network or the automated network experience. And then finally, it enables the certification of these MEF 3.0 SD WAN services. So that drives confidence, which in turn drives market growth. We've got pretty broad support across a number of service providers, technology vendors, and testing companies. So thank you for all of those that have participated. For those that are not currently participating, we'd love to have you working with us in these areas. The more eyes, the better. The more input we can get, the better. And so the MEF-70 document series, we published the first version, 70 itself, at the end of July. And that defines the service attributes of the externally visible behaviors. So those are what the service provider and the subscriber must agree on. Defines traffic handling rules, and it introduces key technical concepts like what an SD-WAN uni is, what an SD-WAN edge is. And again, this is the externally visible behavior and language. The internal supersonic carrier pigeons are not exposed. That allows each vendor or service provider to bring the pigeon of their choice to the market. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Ralph, who will get into the details.
Thanks, AJ. So what I'd like to do is now capture what AJ has taken in the beginnings, just introducing the MEF-70 standard, and now walk through some of the more details of that. My name is Ralph Santitoro, and I head digital services practice at Fujitsu. And one of the things, we are an SD-WAN service provider, and one of the things that really encouraged me to work on this project, the MEF-70 project, is just going out there and talking to subscribers or potential subscribers and seeing how much confusion there was in the market. What is an SD-WAN? What it was called an SD-WAN that really had maybe SD-WAN-like properties, but really was not very comprehensive. And so this is the beginning of a journey. As AJ said, MEF-70 is the first one. We're already working on MEF-70.1. We have a MEF-88 security session we'll hear a little bit later. So without that, let's go jump into the details. So one of the things about an SD-WAN service that's very different than a connectivity service, you heard about layer 1, layer 2, and layer 3 connectivity services today, is that it's focusing on the application. So to say that an SD-WAN service is just automating your underlay service with SDN principles would be insufficient. It happens to do that, but really what we're looking at with SD-WAN in terms of a service definition is it focuses on everything at the application level. So there are obviously packets involved, but really what the end user subscriber is interested in is the applications. How does my application perform? Which in turn means packets have to perform that way, but not have to go all the way down to the lower networking layers, really focus on policies and application layers. And so with this, just like with any other MEF service that we've defined, we define what the demarcation point is, and we call that the SD-WAN uni, following similar principles that you've heard earlier on the definition for uni for optical transport and carrier Ethernet and IP services. The other thing within our SD-WAN service definition is it is a layer 3 IP-based transport. And the reason why this is really important is because we've defined SD-WAN as an overlay service, okay? So it can run over any type of underlay. It could run over a layer 1, layer 2, or layer 3 underlay, or even MPLS, IP MPLS, et cetera. So it's agnostic of the underlay network, or we call it underlay connectivity service. And that's really important because this brings you now into the digital service age where over-the-top services allow for a lot of automation. Just like in cloud services, or maybe take a step back, if you looked at what happened in the world of video, where you have streaming services. Before TV, you had to have cable TV and you actually watched channels. Now you can stream channels as over-the-top services. So this brings us into an over-the-top type of service in the networking services realm that allows for lots of things that are just not possible when you're dealing with just the physical underlay. The key part about the service definition is when we take packets, and I'll walk you through an example of this, where we classify IP packets and be able to identify what the application is. And we can classify those anywhere from layer 2 to layer 7. So maybe you have a unique set of applications on a particular VLAN ID, so that would be layer 2, all the way up to layer 7, which is the actual application name, for example, Office 365 or something like that. In terms of the underlay network, so one of the beauties of SD-WAN is that it allows, you can operate over any type of underlay from any service provider, but more importantly, an SD-WAN service is best when you have multiple underlays. If you just had a single underlay, it's okay, it still will operate, but multiple underlays is where you really get the benefits, and I'll walk you through a couple of use cases on that later. Policy management is a really key part of this. So with the other connectivity services, there are things like setting up the network parameters, et cetera, but you don't really focus on policy, which is much more at a user level, just like applications are at a user level. So that's what makes the SD-WAN service very unique. A couple of other key things are in terms of encryption. So security, some aspects of security are baked into an SD-WAN service. So an SD-WAN service can operate over a public network, for example, internet or broadband type of access network, and in which case the applications are encrypted over that. Some of the other key characteristics of the SD-WAN service is that you have you can apply policy in various different ways, right? So you could have security policies that are being defined in MEF-88 now, but you can also have application policies that focus on, do I have a bandwidth policy or a QoS, performance policy based on maybe some type of prioritization. So we're doing the similar things that we've done with the other connectivity services, but we're focusing on them from a policy perspective as opposed to class of service, and all that stuff happens at the lower layers, but again, policy is much more at a user layer. And then a couple of other key things about an SD-WAN service is it introduces this concept of co-managed service. So a lot of network services are fully managed. The service provider takes care of everything. In the case of SD-WAN, typically you get a subscriber portal where now the subscriber can actually create new policies, maybe add new applications and apply actions to those different applications, where in the past for traditional underlay connectivity services, they couldn't do that. And then finally, have all this automation. Obviously, we need to tie this all into the LSO framework. So in terms of one of the things we had to do as a baseline, this one slide, how many in here either use or sell SD-WAN services today? Just out of show of hands. Okay, few. This slide is the one slide you want to leave with, because when you have a conversation with your potential subscribers or your buyers of your service, you need to talk the same language. You need to talk what makes up an SD-WAN service, what are all the components that make it up, so that when you walk in there, they understand it, you understand it, you use in a common vernacular. And so just like with the MEF services, all the MEF services I mentioned earlier, we have a user-to-network interface, which is really the demarc between the responsibility of the provider and the subscriber. The SD-WAN virtual connection, or SWVC, very similar to the other VC concepts we have with like carrier Ethernet EVCs, right, OVCs, et cetera. And so that's the fundamental. When you instantiate the SWVC, that says all of these unis are part of this SD-WAN service. So I know exactly, if I do an inventory, I know exactly all the sites that are part of that SD-WAN service. The SWVC endpoint is where that SWVC basically connects to the unis. Now the SD-WAN edge is a really important concept. So we had to define an SD-WAN edge versus other services. We just define the uni and say it can be implemented any way carrier Ethernet use NIDs, maybe IP services use routers. We had to define an SD-WAN edge because there's certain functionality that has to be done at the edge on the customer prem that allows you to do the classifying IP packets and being able to determine what those applications are of those packets and being able to do some policy management. So the SD-WAN edge is really your policy enforcement point, where policies are basically pushed down and actually enforced, blocking traffic, allowing traffic, et cetera. The underlay connectivity service, so this was a new term we introduced. So, you hear the term WAN, you hear transport network, you hear, MPLS, WAN, MPLS VPN, it has tons and tons of names. We wanted to come up with one name, underlay connectivity service. So if it's an MPLS VPN service, an internet service, broadband service, carrier Ethernet service, that's your UCS. Tunnel virtual connections are basically, if you think about this, because it's an overlay service, you need to be able to build overlay connections between the different SD-WAN unis in the network. And that allows you to be able to run, given that over-the-top nature of an SD-WAN service, that allows this service to run over any type of UCS, underlay connectivity service. And then finally, internet breakout is, it's a very critical function of an SD-WAN service in that you need to be able to, as more and more applications are going directly to the internet, you don't have to go over a TVC to go to a central internet breakout location. More and more subscribers are moving they want to do the breakout locally because that gives them the best performance. And you see things like everybody, people are moving from Microsoft Exchange servers on-prem to Office 365 in the cloud, right? So more and more Salesforce.com, it runs in the cloud. More and more applications are running in the cloud, so the internet it's playing a larger and larger and larger role to reach the applications that you want to reach. And that's why that's a really critical capability. So what I'd like to do is, the last part here is just walk through a walkthrough of some key concepts for an SD-WAN service. So the application flow classification and policy enforcement is really critical concepts. So if you go to the left of the diagram, you have packets coming in at the SD-WAN uni, and when those packets come into the SD-WAN edge, which is the gray box, the SD-WAN edge has no idea what application they belong to, right? They're just packets. Packets are packets, right? Once it comes in to the SD-WAN edge at the uni, now you have to classify. And you determine, so you're classifying in a number of different varieties that are defined in MEF-70. So I mentioned before layer 2 through layer 7, but you can do, classify on port numbers, determine the application, protocol IDs. You can actually do a layer 7, up to layer 7 classification and determine what the application is. So that's a key part of the service. So in this case, when I've done my application classification, on the right side of the diagram, I have 2 UCSs, maybe one's internet, maybe one's MPLS. And I have 4 TVCs or tunnels that are built across the UCSs. So I have 4 choices. So at this point in time, I'm classifying the packet, determining what the application is. Maybe it's Office 365, maybe it's SAP, whatever the application is. But that's all I'm doing at this point. The next step is now I'm going to apply a policy. So I have some policies that I've created. And these are some that we've defined here. Do I want to encrypt the traffic or not? Do I want to force it to only go over a private UCS like MPLS, or can it also go over an encrypted public UCS connection? So all the TVCs are encrypted over the internet, et cetera, et cetera. So there's these different policies that we've defined where you take action to apply to those flows. So in this case, only TVC 3 and 4 meet the match criteria. So before I had a choice of 4 TVCs to go over. After I've now applied policies, I only have 2. And then if I continue going forward, I have to make a forwarding decision. Well, which TVC do I go over? And so if I look at this, really TVC 2 is really the only choice in this particular application. So as you go through each of these steps, the choices, now this case is only showing 1 TVC, which is probably very unique. Usually you'll have multiple TVCs and then you can decide which one you want to use for that, maybe based on additional policy criteria, or use either one. So finally, I'll just close with 2 use cases. So for an SD-WAN service, we're showing this in the form of the LSO architecture, but what I would really want to focus on is the bottom part of the diagram, which is what MEF-70 is really focusing on at this point in time. So this is probably the most popular use case, is running over what's called a hybrid WAN use case. So you have an MPLS or some type of private, maybe carrier Ethernet or MPLS, and some type of an internet, maybe broadband, DIA, it doesn't really matter. But having these 2 UCSs, this is the most common case. Now, one of the things is the TVCs are, your traffic is encrypted. So even though you're going over the public internet, it's all encrypted. The other thing with this is traditionally internet was used just for local breakout to go to public internet sites, and then TVC, and then the private network was to connect your other sites. Well, with SD-WAN, you're kind of load balancing and bonding these two WANs together to basically now get this bandwidth. So MPLS bandwidth is generally very, very small, and internet's very, very large just because of the cost differentials. But now we're combining these, now you can take advantage of that internet bandwidth that was used only before to go to the internet, and now you can use it for your site-to-site bandwidth or site-to-cloud. And having multiple networks allows additional resiliency, right? You have different paths, you have different providers that can deliver this. And then that's a really key thing, is being able to use whatever provider of the UCS you would like to use. That's a really huge benefit, because maybe in certain regions it's more competitive. Other regions you might have one provider, but then you also have an internet provider as well. And so the second use case, which is becoming more and more popular, is dual internet UCS. And what I see, as an SD WAN service provider, we come across this where the MPLS contract is expiring, and the service provider or the subscriber is basically saying, I can either renew my contract for MPLS, or let me go try just putting in a separate broadband circuit in there, or internet, maybe a DIA circuit in there. Could be from the same provider, it doesn't really matter. But they're willing to use that and take advantage of additional packet loss correction capabilities and things like that of the SD-WAN edge. And so in this case, the connections are encrypted over these different internet connections. Having multiple ISPs is a really good thing, because now you can have provider diversity. And you have increased network resiliency and availability, right? Because you have multiple paths that you can send the traffic. So if one ISP had a failure or something, you can switch over to the other ISP there. And then finally, since we talked about SD-WAN service is an over-the-top service and can run over any underlay connectivity service, the SD-WAN service provider doesn't have to be the same as the underlay connectivity provider. So this gives the subscriber more choices to go out and pick the best SD-WAN service provider they want, and it doesn't necessarily have to be to deliver the underlay connectivity services as well. So with that, I'd like to pass it on to Mark to talk about next steps and projects.
So we're going to look at where we're going now. So this has been the summary of where we've been and what we've done to date. This is going to look at where we're going next. So next thing, the most obvious thing we do next is the next version of the MEF-70 project, MEF-70.1. There is a ton of new stuff in here. I'm quite surprised quite how much there is. And we started off with an idea that it would be kind of capturing the stuff we didn't have time to put into the original MEF-70 document. But I think in the conversations we've had around this, and certainly the way that we're trying to knit this in with other things, there are some important new concepts which are coming out, not just within not just within an SD-WAN context, but within a broader MEF context. So we're really starting to look at how we capture a UCS into an SD WAN service and put some language around that so that we can kind of normalize that. And I'm just going to bring up the application security, because one of the other key concepts that we're bringing is something which is common to both the application security and the SD-WAN work, this concept of zones. If you are unfamiliar with what zones are, don't worry, because it's a very new concept and we are actively capturing it at the moment. If you want to find out more, then come to the sessions. If you're here through the rest of the week, then come sit in, listen, contribute, and help us shape what we think these zones are. But zones are effectively a way of capturing what the customer traffic is that is being supported by the SD WAN service. So almost looking beyond the uni and saying, well, look, what's actually arriving here? How do I group that? How do I capture that? And then how do I present that almost as a requirement for what the SD WAN service needs to deliver all the application security service needs to deliver. So application security, another brand new piece of work. We are going to go to a call for comment on that just after the LA meeting. In fact, both of these documents on screen are going to go to a call for comment just after this meeting. So, if you are MEF members in the crowd, and I guess most of you must be, read the document. They're pretty well written. They're pretty easy to understand. Tell us what you think. Give us some feedback. We would certainly welcome that. We're also looking at kind of how we start to broaden this. So we've got a bunch of attributes. Now we want to look and see how do we put those into actual standards, into the LSO framework, and how do we model that information. And we also have some work on intent. John will go into that in chapter and verse later on today. I won't cover that now, not least because I've only got 4 minutes left. Another thing that we want to look at is how do we get multi-vendor SD-WANs working together, and what are the key touch points for making that happen. So an obvious touch point is looking at Presto API, so that's the provisioning API down into the individual SD WAN service. But there are other kind of internal touch points which are important as well. So if you're looking at how you integrate the service orchestrator into the business application layer, how do you share information? How do I share information back to a subscriber? What's interesting, what isn't interesting? But then how do I share that up into the service orchestrator as well? So how do I look at what performance management information is useful that I need to make a decision on, and then which of that information would I forward onto my subscriber? So really kind of getting into some of that work. We have a new project kicking off, which we hope will be approved at this meeting, which is going to get into that kind of performance management area. Again, a really interesting area to start looking at. The other big thing which is going to kick off at this meeting as well is we are starting to actively collaborate with ONUG in the SD-WAN space. So those of you who understand the SD-WAN space will have been aware that we've both been working in this area. And this meeting marks the first time that we're really going to start to ingest some of what the ONUG team has been working on and start to push that into our standards work as well, so we can take advantage of all the great work that they've done, and we can kind of collaborate together between the two organizations. So this is a really important kind of next phase for the way that SD-WAN standardization is going to be taken forward in the industry, and it's exciting. We've got a couple of ONUG guys here. And again, if you're going to stop for the technical meeting at the end of the week, we're going to spend some time reviewing their content and starting to figure out how we use that for the MEF service definitions. Who here has read MEF-70? Go on. I'll out you. Wow, that's more than I expected. If you haven't read MEF-70 because you thought it might be a bit much, read this white paper. There's going to be a brand new white paper coming out after this meeting, which will supersede the original white paper that we put out. And it does a really good job of capturing the essence of what is in MEF-70, and then putting it into context as well, so kind of helping to understand how SD-WAN can be used to support different industry verticals, and to look into some more of those use cases. So this is going to be hot off the press, I think, probably a couple of weeks. Tomorrow, there we go, hot off the press tomorrow. You heard it here first. Well, probably you didn't, but anyway, I've said it. So read it. It's a great document, and does a really good job of summarizing it. So yeah, this is where we are. This is our kind of summary of what we have with SD-WAN. We have a great core spec. I'm very happy with the contribution that we've had. We have had pretty much everyone who's a big player in SD-WAN contribute, provide text, read the document, comment on the document. So this is a pretty rock solid first document. And now we're looking forward into the future at the next version of that document and into application security. The other thing we're going to have as well is some professional certification around SD-WAN. That's going to be available in mid-November. And there's a certification process which is kicking off as well. If you attend the certification committee, you'll have seen that's been being talked about. We're going to start to be able to actually certify SD WAN services and be able to put that MEF Badger certification on the front of it as well. So that is really important as well. And that is, I think, everything I was going to say. Yeah, there we go.